As I said, this is where our study is going to be this morning. We're quickly winding down. We've just got a couple more, 2 or 3 more classes to take care of in our study of the book of Revelation. And for those of you who have been in here since the beginning of this study, it's hopeful that you were able to get a little bit out of it. We spent quite a bit of time dealing with the introduction of it and introducing us to apocalyptic literature. And so when we become familiar with that, it perhaps will make it a little bit easier in our understanding. In chapter 20 that we're going to be looking at today, John is actually going to see 4 images, and he's going to reveal these to us, although they may be interrelated in some way and in some capacity. The first vision that John sees is the binding of Satan. He observes this in the first 3 verses, and we'll talk about that. Then he's going to see, I lost my feed here, Tim. Where'd Tim go? He's going to see the 1,000-year reign in verses 4 through 6. The next vision, he's going to see the complete defeat of Satan, who has been behind all of the persecution that has occurred in the book. And then he's going to see the great judgment, the great white throne of judgment. So those are the 4 visions, are the 4 scenes that John is going to lay out to us in chapter 20, in the 15 verses in chapter 20. Now, what we're going to need to do is kind of go back and get a handle on where we are in our study. Let's go back and talk a little bit back in chapter 17 about the harlot. Remember, John saw this harlot that was all decked out in gaudy apparel, and she was riding upon this 7-headed beast. Who is the harlot that John saw? Saw the decadent great city of Rome. And so that's who the harlot represents in the book of Revelation. She then is turned against, or those who were the 10 puppet kings turned against Rome and devoured her or destroyed her. And this is what we see back in chapter 17 and verse 16. These will hate the harlot. That is, those kings and kingdoms who had committed fornication with Rome. That is, they were supplied by Rome. And all of these things that we talked about early on, they turn on Rome. All of this is the Lord's doing, by the way. The Lord said that He put it in their hearts to do this, and that's exactly what they did. Rome was destroyed, which this is sort of a drawing of the city of Rome. It's an interesting thing. This drawing of the city of Rome that I have up here, I want to kind of deviate just a little bit and tell you a little bit about this. What you see here in the foreground is you see what's known as the pleasure palace of Nero. You know, all of us are probably pretty familiar with the secular history of Rome when it came to the burning of Rome in the 1st century. And most historians say that Nero was behind the burning of Rome. And of course, there's the saying that Nero was fiddling while Rome burned. There's evidence that he was watching the city of Rome burn, and he probably did have a lot to do with it, because the part of the city that burned was private dwellings. Now, after the burning of the city, like politicians today, he didn't let a crisis go to waste. He annexed all of that which had been destroyed and made it public property, and made it property of the government. And then he built this elaborate thing that we see here that was really Nero's folly, or his pleasure palace. And he had this lake, and he had walking trails and all of these other things that he built. And this would have been, of course, standing during the time that these Christians were being persecuted in the 1st century. But now, what God is saying is that I'm going to be behind the destruction of this. And so it's not going to continue. The persecuting forces are not going to continue. I saw an interesting television program a week or so ago. As a matter of fact, it was a documentary on the architecture of ancient Rome. And I just was mesmerized by the show. And one of the things that they talked about was Nero's pleasure palace. That a few emperors after Nero lived, then it was destroyed. It was torn down. Basically, a lot of it was torn down and actually covered over. And it has of late been unearthed. And of course, this is some of the things that's kind of hard to see there. It's kind of dark. But this is some of the remains now of Nero's pleasure palace. And what I thought was interesting in the documentary that I observed a week or so ago was they said after they began to excavate Nero's pleasure palace, they were able to get inside of it and see just how elaborate and how gold inlaid it was. But the announcer used this terminology. He said when they finally were able to get into the belly of the beast. And I thought that was interesting because they have absolutely no interest in the study of the book of Revelation, but I thought their terminology was interesting because this is how John is describing Rome. It is a beast. And God has said, I'm going to destroy the beast. And so when you see the remains today, you see the remains of the, or you're actually in the belly of the beast. This is actually the Nero's pleasure palace. God had said, the sound of harpists, musicians, flutists, and trumpets shall not be heard in you anymore. No craftsman of any craft shall be found in you anymore. And the sound of a millstone shall not be heard in you anymore. The light of a lamp shall not shine in you anymore. It's going to go out. The persecuting forces of Rome are going to be destroyed. The beast, let me go back up. The harlot, the city of Rome, the beast, the empire of Rome, the false prophet, the cult of forced emperor worship, all of these are going to be destroyed. Now, we saw in chapter 18, 17 and 18, the destruction of the harlot. Now, as we get over into chapter 19, we're going to see then the beast was captured. This is what we studied recently. And with him the false prophet who worked signs in his presence by which he deceived those who received the mark of the beast and those who worshipped the image. These two were cast alive into the lake of fire burning with brimstone. That's what then happened to the beast and the false prophet. So I've said all of that to say this. God had been promising throughout the book to these suffering Christians, I'm going to intervene. Your cause is not lost. The death of your brethren was not in vain. I'm going to do something. So he's destroyed the city of Rome, or at least he's going to decimate the city of Rome. The empire is going to be destroyed, the beast. The false prophet is going to be removed. That is the cult of forced emperor worship. But now, that leaves us in our study with the power behind the beast, the false prophet, and the harlot. And that is Satan. What about the dragon, that serpent of old, the devil and Satan? Now keep in mind where we are in our study. God is taking out the enemies one at a time. It is all the doing of God. Now we get into chapter 20, and we're going to see now what happens to Satan. The power behind Rome, the power behind the empire, and the power behind the cult of emperor worship. That's what chapter 20 is basically going to reveal to us. But before we do that, I want us to consider something. And I hate to have to do this, but I think it's absolutely vital that we do this in our study. There is a prevalent doctrine that exists in the religious world, especially in Protestantism, known as premillennialism. And and I'll talk a little bit more about that, but that's a doctrine that finds as its source, at least they tell us, the first 6 verses of Revelation 20. Because this is the only passage in all the Bible that talks about a 1,000-year reign. And so based upon these verses that we need to look at this morning, this doctrine known as premillennialism was born and has permeated, like I say, most of the Protestant denominational world and as a matter of fact, even invaded churches of Christ some time ago. You take down in Louisville, Kentucky, this is kind of the beginning place of premillennialism among churches of Christ. They used to have a school down there, that, and maybe still do, Portland School, that advocated such as that. R.H. Bold and all of those guys, if you're familiar with that, was down in that particular area. But let me explain to you what we mean here. Pre, of course, is before. It's talking about Jesus is going to return before the millennial reign, or the 1,000 years upon this earth. And when you place the suffix ism there, that just simply is a doctrine or a belief. And so when we talk about premillennialism, we're talking about the belief that Jesus is going to return, set up His kingdom, and reign for 1,000 years upon this earth, based upon the verses that we're going to be looking at this morning. As a matter of fact, before we go into that any farther, let's stop just a moment and read these first 6 verses, keeping in mind the doctrine of premillennialism. And now let's read these verses. John said, "Then I saw an angel from heaven, or an angel coming down from heaven, having the key to the bottomless pit, a great chain in his hand. And he laid hold of the dragon, that serpent of old, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. And he cast him into the bottomless pit, shut him up, set a seal on him, so that he should deceive the nations no more, till the 1,000 years were finished. But after these things he must be released for a little while. And I saw a throne, and they sat on it, and judgment was committed to them. And I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for the witness of Jesus, for the word of God, who had not worshipped the beast or his image, and had not received his mark on their foreheads or in their hands. And they lived and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. But the rest of the dead did not live again until the 1,000 years were finished. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy is he who has part in the first resurrection. Over such, the second death has no power, but they shall be priests of God and of Him and of Christ, and shall reign with Him 1,000 years." So based upon those verses that we read, and then kind of going to other places in the Bible, the man of sin out of the book of Thessalonians, the Antichrist out of the book of 1 John, they're able to weave this doctrine of premillennialism together. Now, what I want to do here is I made this little timeline chart yesterday to just kind of give you an idea. Now, what they tell us in premillennialism is that when Jesus was born into this world, He came to establish His kingdom, to reign on the throne of David over His kingdom. Now, they came to, as a matter of fact, He said, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. So what He did, He came to establish the kingdom of God. But now premillennialism says that rather than doing this, He was rejected. The Jews rejected Him. He came to His own, and His own received Him not. So He was rejected. And therefore, when He was being rejected, He set up the church instead. He came to establish the kingdom. He was rejected by the Jews, and so therefore He established the church instead of the kingdom. So, what they're saying is, when Jesus was rejected, He built the church instead of the kingdom. Now, it kind of goes like this. Here's the timeline that I tried to put together. Jesus came, we're told, to establish the kingdom of Daniel 2. As a matter of fact, He said in Mark 9, verse 1, "There are those standing here who shall not taste of death till the seed of the kingdom come with power." But now, that's what Jesus intended to do, but He was rejected, and He was put on the cross instead. And so then what Jesus did is establish the church. And so what we're doing now is living in the church age. You hear people talking about that. This is the church age. And the church actually has 7 ages, beginning with the church at Ephesus, a loveless age, and going all the way up to the church at Laodicea, a lukewarm age. And they say that's the age in which we now live. This is the doctrine of premillennialism. And they say after this church age, there's going to be this rapture, where all of the saints then will be caught up to be with the Lord. And that's what the impetus of the Left Behind series that has gained popularity in the movies. The idea that there's going to be this rapture of all the saved people going to be caught up. You have seen, I have at least in the past, seen automobiles with the bumper sticker that says, in case of rapture, this vehicle will be unmanned or be driverless. That's the idea behind that. So there's going to be this rapture. And now after all the saints, the saved, are caught up to be with the Lord, there's going to be 7 years of tribulation that is brought about by the man of sin who is imposing the mark of the beast. There's going to be tribulation that's going to occur on the earth. Now after the 7 years of tribulation, Jesus is going to return with His saints, engage in the battle of Armageddon, defeat all the enemies of righteousness, and set up His throne, or set up His kingdom, and reign upon His throne for 1,000 years. Now, after the 1,000-year period, of course, then comes the end. And the earth is going to be burned up. It's going to be destroyed, 2 Peter chapter 3. Then there's going to be the judgment that we'll all stand before, and be divided, the goats and the sheep. And the sheep will be the saved. They'll go into heaven, and the goats will be the lost, and they'll go into hell. That's the doctrine known as premillennialism. I've just kind of given you an overview, sort of a Cliff Note version of it. And that's based basically on the fact that John talks about a 1,000-year reign in verse 4 of Revelation chapter 20. I like to tell people, here's the thing about that. If you talk to your neighbors and your friends and ask them, do you believe in premillennialism, chances are going to be very good that they're going to look back at you and say, I don't know what you're talking about. And the reason is that they may not hear the word expressed, used. But if you begin to describe this doctrine that I've just described to you, they're going to say, oh yes, I believe in that. Because when Sue and I were members of the Nazarene Church, we believed in just what I have distributed, or what I have shown you here this morning, but we never heard the word premillennial used. And so the doctrine is there. It permeates. It saturates. As a matter of fact, it used to guide the foreign policy of this country as far as the nation of Israel and the Middle East is concerned. And it's all based upon a misunderstanding, and I say that kindly, and a misapplying of what John is talking about. What people have done is forgotten the nature of apocalyptic literature. And they're literalizing some things that are said here that are obviously written in symbolic language, written in signs and symbols. Now, before we go on and look at these verses and try to get an understanding of them, anyone have any comments or observations about what it is that we put up here? Mike?
They talk as if this is true and it's going to happen, but if God wasn't able to do it the first time, they overlook what happens if Jesus rejects the second time.
Yeah, that's probably just a minor problem with them. You're right. You're absolutely right. What would prevent a rejection the second time? That's a good thought. Now let's do now, and I'm going to go by answering the questions, and then begin to talk a little bit about what those verses are actually saying there. The first question on our worksheet: John saw an angel having the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain in his hand. Now let's keep in mind, we're talking about signs and symbols. John is not expecting us to see a big hole in the ground that has no end to it. In the picture here, you see a key and a chain and a pit and an angel, and all of this is a mural that John is seeing here, is a vision that John is seeing here. So what we've got to do is try to understand what the vision is and perhaps what it's representing. What do you think this image of an angel with a key to the bottomless pit and a chain, what does this image suggest? What is it imparting to us? Okay?
Well, the key to indicates authority. I mean, I have the keys to my car, which is a pretty good indication that I have the right to drive it. And so an angel having a key to this bottomless pit, he would have the authority over it and who goes into that.
Okay. And David brought up an interesting thing. I'm going to just check your memory here just a little bit. Does anybody recall back in chapter 1 of the book of Revelation someone else having a key? Anybody remember who had a key in chapter 1? It was Jesus, and he had the key to death and Hades. He had control over death and Hades. He was in control of that. And I bring that up just simply to say that I agree with what David is saying here. What we see is when someone has a key, they have control or authority to lock, unlock, open, close. And then, of course, the chain is a chain of binding. Now, let's think about this for a moment. Back in chapter 9, verses 1 through 3, the devil had the key to the bottomless pit, to the abyss. You remember? And out of that abyss came smoke and locusts and all of these other things that the devil had control over. He released all manner of decadence. He released all manner of filth and degradation. And that's what the devil had control of. Now, when we get into chapter 20, we see that the devil has lost his power. The angel now has authority to bind or to restrict the activities of Satan. As far as these Christians were concerned, Satan had Rome, the empire, false prophet, just unrestricted powers and authority, putting these people to death, burning them as torches, allowing them to be devoured by animals. Their power was boundless, unlimited. But now we see God is stepping in. The angel now has authority to bind or to restrict the activities of Satan. The harlot, the beast, the false prophet have all been finished. Now the devil, who is behind it all, is being bound. So that's what you see in the first 2 or 3 verses of chapter 20. Now, tell what happened to the devil. Let's just talk. I don't want an explanation yet, but I just want us to look at verses 2 and 3. And let's try to list everything that he says happened. Now remember, the angel's got authority over the devil. That is, the representative of God is reining in the power of the devil, who was behind the beast, the false prophet, and the harlot. His power has been reined in. Now John is going to see and tell us exactly what happened in these verses to the devil. What are some of the things that are happening here? Okay. Now we'll start with that. He was bound for 1,000 years. Keep that thought in mind. What else?
Cast into the pit.
Okay. He was cast into the bottomless pit in verse 3. And? Say again? Okay. He's closed up and he was sealed. He was unable to deceive the nations till the 1,000 years were finished or fulfilled, according to verse 3. Now there's one other thing. Say again? Well, let's have a seal. I'm kind of counting that in chapter in number 3 too. Linda?
He's going to be released.
That's the third thing. He's going to be released, or the fourth thing rather. He's going to be released for a little while. Okay, now that is the vision. What is the meaning? What is the message here? Right?
His power is going to be taken away to be able to have the absolute control that you mentioned there over nations, over the powers that be. He's going to be loose at that point. He's going to be tied up. He's going to be shut up. He's going to have that captivity. And then after a little bit, after all those things are done, they'll be released.
Okay. Now, what you got to do is like Brad is doing here. You've got to see the vision. You've got to get the message there, but you've also got to get the meaning, that which is behind it. So let's think about that for a moment. He's going to be bound for 1,000 years. That's not literal years. And so if that's not literal years, we have to recognize that there's not going to be a literalization of 1,000 in verse 4. Not talking about years. It is a complete, a total. It's 10 multiplied. Actually, to the third power. Yeah, 10 multiplied to, I think I have that up there. I worried about that because I know David was sitting here. He didn't read it. It's always intimidating to try to talk about figures and numbers when there's an accountant in the assembly. But I thought I had that right. But anyway, remember 10 was a perfect number. We talked about numerology as we began our study of the book. Now, it is complete. It is total. I don't know if I got the right scripture reference up there. That don't look familiar. I'm going to go back to Psalm 50 and see if, in fact, I misapplied a verse here. Psalm 50 and verse 10. Yeah, I got the right verse. Thank you. I got the right verse. It just didn't look right. Back in Psalm 50 and verse 10, he's talking about God and God's ownership. And he said that God, owns the cattle or has the cattle on 1,000 hills. That didn't mean that God only owned the cattle on the literal 1,000 hills. It meant that God had total authority or ownership over the cows, universal, worldwide. And so that's what we're seeing here. The devil is going to be completely and totally defeated here. Not thrown in jail and then paroled in the sense of after this literal 1,000 years. He was cast into the bottomless pit. Now this doesn't suggest that Satan is now impotent, because he walks about as a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour. So he has power. He has authority. But the authority that he had over Rome and over nations like Rome has been severely curtailed. It has been restrained. He's closed up and sealed so that he's unable to deceive the nations till the 1,000 years were fulfilled. The idea about that is, here's the thing. You go back to chapter 12. What the devil has done since actually nearly the beginning of time, going back to Genesis chapter 3, what the devil has done is made an attempt to thwart or crush the will of God and the purpose of God. And since that time, the devil has been actually unleashing himself upon humanity to destroy the purpose of God. He tried to destroy the will of God when it came to the saving of souls. This is what's talked about in chapter 12. The devil was ready to devour the man-child that the woman was about to deliver. And we talked about how that Herod, tried to kill all of the children upon the birth of Jesus, 2 years and under, as he was trying to calculate, just how old the Lord would have been at that time. And so from that time forward, the devil has tried everything. The temptations of Jesus in Matthew chapter 4. All of these things were done to impede or to destroy the will of God, to keep God from fulfilling His purpose. And He's always been unsuccessful at this. At the resurrection of Jesus, the head of the serpent was crushed. And so even now in the book of Revelation, He set His sights upon the children of the woman, as it were, or those who were faithful to the Lord. He set His sights upon them. That's not going to succeed either. There's nothing going to stop or prevent the will of God from being fulfilled. That's a promise that is contained in these verses here and throughout the book. When He's released for a little while, we'll talk more about that in verse 7. It kind of reveals to us that so long as the earth remains, Christians are going to be in a battle. Christians are going to be in a battle as long as we live upon this earth. We see that occurring in our lives every day. Perhaps not to the extent that these Christians did, perhaps not even to the extent that some who profess Christianity throughout the world today are undergoing, but we're going to battle for as long as we're here. Now, what God is saying, and what we see in these first few verses, is God is saying, I'm going to limit the devil's control. He's not going to be able to have unlimited control over the nations as he did with Rome and his efforts to destroy Christianity. We're receiving a kingdom that shall not be moved, that is not be destroyed. Question 3. Now we get over here, and they lived and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. Who is said to reign with Christ for 1,000 years, according to verse 4? Everybody? Linda?
The souls of the dead got received the mark of the beast.
Okay. Yeah, now, but what we need to do is just like Linda, we got to stay within the context. Those who had been beheaded for the testimony of Jesus. That points us back. Remember the opening of the 5th seal, Revelation 6. I saw under the altar those who had been beheaded for the testimony of the Lord, testimony of Jesus. They cried out, How long, O Lord, holy and true? Do you avenge us, or avenge the blood of those upon the earth? Told them to wait a while. It's not time yet, but it's going to happen. Now we see they were first under the altar, crying out. Now they're on thrones, reigning with the Lord. They've gone from martyrdom to royalty here in our study. Those who had died and those who had not received the mark, either on their foreheads or right hand. Those who received the mark did not literally, as far as I'm able to understand, receive a tattoo with 666 on it. It just simply is that they were worshiping the beast. They were honoring the emperor as God. Now, some did it sincerely, with mind. Others did it with mental reservation, with the hand. But in either way, it was sinful. And those who did not, those who trusted the Lord and did not do this, they were also reigning with the Lord. 1,000 years, got to keep in mind, is apocalyptic imagery. It's the perfect multiplier. This symbolized the complete, perfect victory over the persecutors. And that's a great, I mean, to me, this is more encouraging. This is more dynamic, and this is more, just a blessing than to think that there's going to be some spiritual Star Wars that takes place sometime out in the future. I mean, that's just fantasy going to seed. This is what's encouraging. God is saying, I am going to have complete victory over your enemies. You will have complete victory over your enemies. You will reign over your enemies that have persecuted you for so very long. And he says, and they that sat on them, and judgment was committed to them. That is against the devil and against Rome. You're going to judge them. Just kind of like Noah, the preacher of righteousness, when he preached and built the ark. He condemned the world. That is, his act of faithfulness to God was that which judged or condemned the world. Their faithfulness to God is that which judged and condemned the beast and the false prophet, the heart. And so you're going to have complete victory over Rome. Absolutely nothing is said in this text about reigning upon the earth. Nothing is said in this text about reigning in Jerusalem. Nothing is said in this text about the second coming of Christ. What this text is talking about is the complete victory and vindication of those persecuted saints. And like I say, that ought to stimulate us to be faithful to the Lord regardless of whatever it is that we may be enduring or suffering here. Any questions, any comments? Just trying to remain kind of on course here with apocalyptic literature. Now, that should be this instead of the, what is this called in verse 5? What we just looked at. It's called something. Yeah. What this is called in verse 5 is the first resurrection. Now that's kind of an interesting term in and of itself, because it lends itself to thinking about things, or thinking about a direction that maybe we ought not be thinking, and certainly ought not be going. This doesn't refer to the general resurrection of the dead at the return of Christ. You see, that's what we were thinking, or most of us. We see, I thought resurrection. I know what a resurrection is. It's the resurrection of all the dead when Jesus returns. That's not what he's talking about here. The resurrection at the return of Christ is going to be what is often referred to as a general resurrection. All that are in the grave shall hear his voice and come forth. All the dead will come forth at the same time. Those who have done good, those who have done evil. Those who are going to receive eternal life, and those who are going to receive eternal damnation. All of this is going to occur at the same time. All of the dead will be raised at the same time. Then that causes us to scratch our head a little bit. Well, first resurrection, then does that mean there's going to be 2 or 3 or 4? First resurrection. Well, we've got to keep in mind the context of what it is that we're looking at here. Because this is not really a literal, bodily resurrection. You see, again, we're dealing with apocalyptic literature. We're dealing with signs and symbols. So what John is saying is not a literal resurrection from the dead. It's the resurrection of the cause of Christianity that the devil has tried to stamp out. And for all intents and purposes, it looked dead. Rome was winning. And God said it's not going to be that way. It's going to be a resurrection. It's sort of like back in Ezekiel chapter 37, the vision of the valley of dry bones. You know, that's a vision of a resurrection. Not a literal resurrection, as the bones seem to symbolize, but it was a vision of the return of Israel from Babylonian captivity. Israel has been raised. And that's what we see here. Christianity has been raised. That is, Rome has not eradicated Christianity. The rest, sometimes we see that the rest, they're going to, they're the ungodly dead, they're going to be raised later. No. The rest are those who will have no part in the victory that Christ has achieved. They are those who serve the beast. They are those who had the mark either on their right hand or on their forehead. They must await the general resurrection from the dead. The martyred are the blessed. They're the ones who gain the victory. Comments, questions? I'm running out of time. I shouldn't spend so much time on premillennialism. You didn't find that interesting anyway. I did. Okay. What will happen to Satan after the 1,000 years, and what will he then do? Hold up. Well, that's what's going to happen now. He's going to be released. That is, he's going to make another effort to defeat the will of God. It never goes away. He'll deceive the nations. His purpose will never change. His tactics do. But so long as the earth remains, the devil will be a formidable foe. And if we take him lightly, we do so at our own peril. The devil is out to destroy the purpose and the will of God. It's like I say, his tactics may change. He may not, dangle before you an image of the emperor and demand that you bow down and worship that emperor. It may be something that we often look at as something sort of benign. But if it is that which comes between us and our Lord, then we have theoretically received that mark, upon our forehead. And he talks about the battle, Gog and Magog. Gog and Magog symbolizes the enemies that were fighting against God back in Ezekiel chapters 38 and 9. Gog was the king of Magog. And they tried, Magog did, to defeat, under the leadership of Gog, the nation of Israel. They were unsuccessful. And this is what we see here. The devil's going to make every attempt. He may attack us with materialism, hedonism, ungodliness, greed, whatever. We may be attacked. But if we remain loyal to the Lord, then we will also be victorious. Forces of evil will always surround the church, but God is going to provide deliverance. And verse 10 talks about the total defeat of Satan. As a matter of fact, verse 10 is the last mention of the devil in the Bible. What is the last thing said of the devil?
Thrown in the lake of fire to be tormented forever and ever.
That's right. That's the last thing we read. You know what? If you want to be loyal to this guy, see where he ends up? He lost. He lost. Cast into the lake of fire and brimstone. That's where the beast and the false prophet are. They'll be tormented day and night forever and ever. But you know, that's something that Jesus promised throughout. That was always the case. Hell was made for the devil and his angels. And the last time we read about the devil, and we read about him being thrown in that place of torment, where he's going to be forever and forever. What then happened to the earth and the heaven when John saw the great white throne? What do you think that means? You know, the earth and heaven did what? They fled. What does that mean? It said the earth and the heavens fled. They were destroyed. That's what Peter prophesies. The psalmist even discusses this. By the way, it will be Christ who sits upon God's throne of judgment. All judgment has been given to the Son. We'll all stand before the judgment seat of Christ. We can either confess Him now, or we can confess Him later. So I run out of time. We're about to run out of Revelation.